The first time Stella Sullivan walked into Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, she knocked the hat clean off a man's head simply by turning around too fast, and she did not apologize even once. She stood 6 feet tall in her boots, which was 2 full inches taller than most men in that town, and a solid 4 inches taller than the sheriff, who watched her from beneath his drooping mustache with a mixture of suspicion and awe as she hauled her single large trunk off the back of the stagecoach without asking for help. Her dark red hair was pinned up in a practical knot, though several pieces had escaped during the long, rattling journey from St. Louis, and her green eyes swept the main street of Caldwell with the kind of frank assessment that most women in 1878 were not supposed to give in public. She was 26 years old. She owned nothing in this world except the contents of that trunk and a handwritten letter of employment, and she had never felt more certain of anything in her life than she felt about leaving Missouri behind forever. The letter had come to her through her cousin Bet, who ran a boarding house in Wichita and who knew everybody worth knowing in 3 counties. It had been written in a cramped, careful hand on good paper, which Stella had noted as a sign of some education, and it had said the following: that a man named Lewis Abbott, owner of the Abbott Ranch some 7 miles east of Caldwell, was in need of a cook and general housekeeper, as his longtime cook Marta Engel had retired to live with her daughter in Topeka. The wage was fair, the accommodations were private, and the work was steady. Her cousin Bet had vouched for the man's character, calling him stubborn as a fence post, but honest to his bones. Stella had accepted without hesitation, because her other option had been to continue taking in laundry in St. Louis for a landlord who raised the rent every 6 months and looked at her like she owed him something more than money. She had not, however, given Lewis Abbott much thought beyond the practical details of the arrangement. She should have. The man who met her in town with a wagon was not what she had pictured. She had pictured someone older, someone weather-beaten in the gray and forgettable way, someone who would look past her without really seeing her. Lewis Abbott was 32 years old, broad-shouldered in a way that seemed less like vanity and more like a lifetime of actual labor, with dark hair that curled slightly at the edges where the wind had gotten to it and brown eyes so steady and calm that they made Stella feel, for just one unsettling moment, like she was being measured by something that knew exactly what it was looking for. He looked at her from boot to crown and then back to her face, and his expression did not change. He was holding his hat in his hands, which she would later understand was simply a habit he had when he was thinking carefully. "You are Miss Sullivan," he said. It was not a question. "I am," she said. "And you are shorter than I expected." He blinked. Then very slowly a crease appeared at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile but was something in that family. "I'm 5'11", he said. "I expect I'm taller than most men you've met." "You expect wrong," she said pleasantly, and picked up one end of her trunk. He picked up the other end without commentary, and they loaded it into the wagon together, and that was how it began. The road out to the Abbott Ranch was long and dry, rutted from spring rains that had already moved on by the time Stella arrived, and the Kansas prairie rolled out on every side in that enormous, undeniable way that had made Stella catch her breath on the stagecoach. She had grown up in Missouri, which had hills and trees and things to lean the eye against. Kansas had none of that. Kansas just had sky and grass and distance, and something about the brutal honesty of it appealed to her in a way she could not yet name. Lewis Abbott drove the wagon with economical movements, keeping the horses to a steady pace, and he did not attempt to fill the silence with pleasantries. Stella appreciated that more than she expected to. Most men, presented with a strange woman on a wagon seat beside them, felt compelled to either explain everything or say nothing in a pointed, uncomfortable way. Lewis simply existed in the silence as if it were furniture, and after a while Stella stopped waiting for it to become awkward and started looking at the land instead. "How many head of cattle?" she asked eventually. 412, he said, "as of last week's count." "How many hands?" 6 full-time, 2 seasonal, he paused. They eat at the bunkhouse. You won't be cooking for them unless the occasion calls for it. And the house? 4 rooms downstairs, 3 up. You'll have the room at the back of the upper floor. It has a window that faces east. She nodded. Good, I wake early. So do I, he said. And then, after a pause, my mother used to say a house that wakes early has nothing to hide. Stella looked at him. He was watching the horses. Your mother sounds like she had opinions, she said. She had more opinions than most preachers have scripture, he said. And this time the crease at the corner of his mouth deepened into something that was undeniably a smile, brief and genuine, and then gone again, like sun between clouds. She turned back to the prairie and felt something small and warm settle somewhere in her chest, and she told herself firmly that it was simply the satisfaction of knowing she had made the right choice in coming here. The ranch house was larger than she had anticipated and considerably better maintained. It was a 2-story frame house that had been whitewashed sometime in the last few years, with a deep porch running the full length of the front, and a kitchen addition built onto the back that was almost as large as the original structure. There were cottonwood trees planted along the south side that were tall enough now to give real shade, and someone had laid a kitchen garden in a fenced square near the back door that had been turned and watered in preparation for planting, but not yet planted. She stood in the kitchen for a long moment, taking it in. It was a serious kitchen. Cast iron stove with 6 burners, a stone sink with a hand pump, a long work table of solid oak, a pantry that was well stocked and well organized, and a row of copper pots hanging from iron hooks that caught the afternoon light and threw it back in warm pieces across the whitewashed walls. Marta kept it well, Stella said. She did, Lewis said from the doorway. She was here 18 years. Stella ran her hand along the edge of the work table. She soaked it in linseed oil, she said. This wood is in better condition than most dining tables I have seen. She was particular about her kitchen. So am I, Stella said and looked at him directly. He held her gaze. Good, he said simply. I didn't advertise for someone to be careless with it. She started that same evening because she saw no reason to delay. She found dried beans, cured ham, cornmeal, and a solid supply of root vegetables in the pantry, and by 7 o'clock she had a pot of ham and bean soup on the stove with skillet cornbread in the oven, and a pot of strong coffee ready on the side. She had not been asked what she would cook or how she would manage. She had simply managed. Lewis came into the kitchen at 7:15, stopped when he smelled the food, and stood there for a moment with an expression she could not quite read. You did not have to do this tonight, he said. I know, she said. Sit down. He sat down. She set a bowl in front of him, a wedge of cornbread on the side, and poured his coffee without asking how he took it, because she had already clocked the coffee tin and the lack of sugar bowl on the table and made her deductions. He took it black. He always had. He ate in silence for a moment. Then he set down his spoon. This is better than Marta's, he said. Don't tell anyone I said that. I will tell everyone I meet, she said, and sat down across from him with her own bowl, because she had been traveling since before sunrise and she was hungry, and she was not going to stand in a corner of her own kitchen to eat it. He looked at her for a beat, and then he laughed. It was short and startled, like it had gotten out before he had a chance to decide whether to let it, and it transformed his face entirely for the 2 seconds it lasted, making him look younger and considerably less composed. You are not what I expected, he said. You expected someone smaller and quieter, she said. I expected someone more. He searched for the word. Manageable, she offered. He was quiet for a moment. I was going to say uncertain, he said. Most people are uncertain when they are new somewhere. I have been uncertain plenty of times, Stella said, dipping her cornbread into the soup. I just have never found it useful to show it. He picked up his spoon again. Fair enough, he said. They ate the rest of the meal in a silence that was surprisingly comfortable for 2 people who had known each other less than 5 hours. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that suited them both, though neither of them would have articulated it that way. Stella ran the house with the same direct efficiency she brought to everything she touched. She planted the kitchen garden in the last week of April, laying out rows of beans, squash, tomatoes, and potatoes with the precision of someone who had grown food before and knew the value of it. She organized the pantry on a rotation system that eliminated waste and ensured that nothing was used before it should be or left past its usefulness. She baked bread every other day, made cheese from the milk of the 2 dairy cows Lewis kept near the barn, and once, on a rainy Wednesday when there was nothing else pressing, taught herself to repair a saddle because the task needed doing, and there was no logical reason she should not know how. Lewis watched all of this with the calm, measuring attention that she had noticed on the very first day, and he did not comment on it, which she found she preferred. Some men would have made a show of being impressed, which would have made her feel like a curiosity. Lewis simply accepted what she did as what she was capable of and adjusted his expectations accordingly, which felt to her like a greater compliment than any amount of visible astonishment. She met his ranch hands in the second week. There were 6 of them, and they ranged in age from 19 to somewhere past 50, and they were a varied and interesting collection of people. The oldest was a Mexican man named Fortunato Reyes, who had worked the land in this territory for decades, and who knew more about cattle than anyone Stella had ever encountered. The youngest was a boy named Jimmy Pratt, 19 years old and eager to the point of exhaustion, who seemed to think that if he moved fast enough in every direction simultaneously, the cattle would simply give up and go where he wanted. There was also a man named Tom Birch who spoke rarely and competently, a pair of brothers named Gus and Dale Holt, who communicated primarily through a system of glances and nods that excluded everyone else, and a man named Silas Crane, who had a gap between his front teeth and a loud laugh, and who, Stella discovered within the first week, was the primary source of information and entertainment for the entire crew. It was Silas who told her, on a Tuesday morning when she brought cold water out to the men during a fence repair, that Lewis Abbott had not always been a quiet man. He used to laugh all the time, Silas said, tipping the ladle back into the bucket and wiping his mouth with his sleeve. Before a leaner, Stella kept her expression neutral. Who is a leaner? Silas looked at Gus Holt, who looked at Dale Holt, who found a very interesting piece of fence post to examine. His wife, Silas said. Was his wife. She passed 4 years ago, fever in the winter, bad one that year. He shook his head. He built this place for her, you know, the porch, the trees, the big kitchen, all of it. Stella looked toward the house. The cottonwood trees were green now in the May warmth, throwing their particular dappled shade across the south wall. I did not know, she said. He doesn't talk about it, Silas said. But I thought you should since you're living in her kitchen and all. He paused. Not to make it strange. It isn't strange. He just got very quiet after and he hasn't really come back from it all the way. Stella carried the water bucket back to the house and stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the copper pots and the linseed-oiled table and the east-facing window in the room upstairs that she slept in every night. She thought about a woman she had never met who had chosen this land and loved it enough that the man who had loved her had made a garden and planted trees in her honor. Then she lit the stove and started on the afternoon baking, because that was what the situation called for. She did not change how she behaved around Lewis. She did not soften her voice or walk more quietly or stop setting her bowl down at the table across from his in the evenings. But she paid a different kind of attention after that, the kind that notices the small things. The way he always walked around the cottonwood trees instead of through their shade. The way he sometimes stood on the porch in the evening looking west at nothing visible. The way he kept a small daguerreotype on the mantel in the sitting room with its face turned slightly toward the wall, not hidden, but not on display. She thought about grief. She knew something about it. Her father had died when she was 16, her mother when she was 22. And she had learned the specific weight of loss that settles in and does not leave but simply changes shape over time, becoming something you carry differently as the years pass. She did not think Lewis's grief was something she could speak to directly, at least not yet, and she did not try. But she understood it, in the quiet way that one person can recognize in another the shape of a wound, even when the wound itself is not visible. What she did not understand, and what she spent an increasing amount of time not thinking about, was the specific way that her pulse behaved when Lewis walked into a room she was already in. It was not a large pulse change. It was not dramatic. It was simply that her body registered his presence before her mind did, which she found inconvenient and entirely inappropriate given the nature of their arrangement. She was his housekeeper. She cooked his meals. She lived in his house. She was there in a professional capacity, and she was sensible enough to know that the particular loneliness of long travel and new surroundings could produce feelings that had more to do with circumstance than with the actual person in front of you. She told herself this on a regular basis, with the conviction of someone who is trying very hard to believe something they do not entirely believe. The difficulty was that Lewis Abbott, despite being quiet and private and still carrying 4 years of grief like a stone in his coat pocket, was one of the most genuine people she had ever encountered. He said what he meant. He did what he said he would do. He treated Fortunato Reyes with the same direct respect he gave to every other hand on his payroll, which in 1878 in Kansas was not as common as it should have been. He did not pretend to know things he did not know, and when Stella corrected him about something, which she did with some regularity and without much softening, he considered her correction and either accepted it or explained his reasoning without defensiveness. He was, in short, a man who could be disagreed with and who did not collapse under the disagreement, which was rarer than gold in Stella's experience. The evening in late May that changed the arrangement between them happened because of a horse. One of Lewis's mares, a gray-named Patience who was nearing the end of a difficult pregnancy, had been laboring since mid-morning and by evening had made no progress that satisfied Fortunato, who knew horses the way he knew cattle and who came to the house at dusk with his hat in his hands and a look of quiet concern that communicated more than words. Lewis went immediately. Stella, who had finished washing up and was reading by lamplight in the kitchen, heard the urgency in the way the door closed and set her book down without thinking about it. She went to the barn. The scene she found was dim and warm with the smell of hay and horse sweat, 2 lanterns hung on posts throwing amber light across the straw. Fortunato and Jimmy were both there, and Lewis was at the mare's side, his coat already off, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, his hands moving with the calm, deliberate competence of someone who had done this before. The mare's breathing was labored and she was turned wrong, and the situation needed more hands than were available. Stella did not ask permission. She moved the lantern to a better angle, took Jimmy's place at the mare's head without ceremony, and kept the animal calm with the same low, steady voice she used on the garden in a drought, talking to her without sentiment but with absolute attention, while Lewis and Fortunato worked. It took another hour. It was difficult and messy, and there were 10 minutes in the middle of it where Stella was genuinely unsure the foal was going to make it. But it did. The foal came into the world on a Thursday night in May in a cloud of steam and relief, all spindly legs and enormous eyes, and Stella laughed out loud once, a large and unguarded laugh that rang off the barn walls and startled everyone in it. She clapped her hand over her mouth. Lewis was looking at her. His face was flushed from the heat and the effort, his hair dark with sweat, and he was looking at her with an expression that she had no immediate category for. "Sorry," she said. "I know it is loud." "Don't apologize," he said. His voice was low and slightly rough. It was a good sound. She took her hand away from her mouth. The foal was making its first unsuccessful attempts to stand, and Fortunato was watching with the satisfied patience of a man who has seen miracles and accepted them as his due. Jimmy was grinning so hard his face looked like it might split, and Lewis Abbott was still looking at Stella Sullivan in the barn lamplight with an expression she was beginning to understand, was the one he wore when something had gotten past his defenses before he had a chance to reinforce them. They walked back to the house together at close to 11 at night. The prairie dark was enormous and star-filled in the way that it got at that hour. The Milky Way sprawled overhead like someone had split a jar of cream across the sky, and the cottonwood trees made a low sound in the night breeze that was very close to breathing. "You were good in there," he said. "I grew up on a farm," she said. "Not cattle, chickens and a milk cow and a miserable pig named Gerald, but animals are animals. You named the pig Gerald. My father named him." My father was a man who named things precisely. He said names should describe the thing they belonged to, and Gerald was exactly the right name for that pig. Lewis laughed again. It was more than the startled half-laugh she had gotten from him over the soup that first night. This one lasted longer and had more body to it, and she felt it somewhere in her sternum. "Did you always live in Missouri?" he asked. "Born and raised," she said. "Texas originally. My father ranched there. I came north in 1870 looking for land that hadn't already been divided a dozen times. And you found it." "I found it," he agreed. "Harder than Texas. The winters here are different, but the land is honest." "The land is enormous," she said, looking at the dark horizon. "In Missouri you can always see where something ends. Here it just keeps going. Does that bother you?" She considered this honestly. "It did for the first 2 weeks," she said. "Now I think it is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." He stopped walking. She stopped a moment later and turned back to find him standing with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at her with that same unguarded quality from the barn, and the starlight was doing something to the planes of his face that she would have preferred it not do. "I thought you might leave," he said quietly, "after the first week. A lot of people find this land too much." "I am not a lot of people," she said. "No," he said, "you are not." They stood there for a moment that lasted slightly longer than was entirely sensible, and then Stella turned back toward the house and walked to the door, and Lewis followed, and they said good night in the hallway at the foot of the stairs with a formality that neither of them felt. She lay awake for a long time in her east-facing room, listening to the prairie wind, and told herself nothing at all, because she had run out of convincing arguments. June arrived with heat and storms, and the particular ferocity of Kansas summer that meant you learned to read the sky the way you read a person's face. Stella learned it. She watched the clouds build in the southwest every afternoon, learned the difference between the ones that were going to amount to nothing and the ones that required her to close every shutter and bring the chickens inside, and she was right often enough that Lewis stopped second-guessing her assessments and started simply acting on them. "How do you know?" Jimmy asked her one afternoon, squinting at a cloud mass that Stella had just declared was going to miss them to the north. "I look at the color," she said, "and the way the grass is moving, and I watch which way the birds go." "Mr. Abbott always checks the barometer," Jimmy said. "The barometer is useful," she said. "So are the birds." The storm missed them to the north. Jimmy was impressed. He told every person on the property about it the next morning at a volume that carried well beyond the barn. It was also in June that Stella had her first serious conflict with Lewis, and it was serious enough that she spent a day and a half uncertain whether she had overstepped in a way that could not be repaired. It began with Fortunato. There was a man in town named Horace Gentry who ran the feed supply, and who had been undercutting the pricing for Mexican workers and former slaves in the area for years, charging them higher rates for the same goods without explanation or apology, which was a practice that was common enough in 1878 to be almost invisible to those who benefited from it, and absolutely impossible to ignore for those who did not. Stella had gone to town for supplies on a Wednesday, and had witnessed Horace Gentry charge Fortunato 12 cents more per sack of grain than the man ahead of him in line had paid for the same grain, and had said so, in the middle of the store, in her loudest and most carrying voice, with the precision of someone who had been calculating arithmetic in their head since the transaction began. Gentry had been unpleasant about it. She had been louder. Eventually, she had paid the correct price on Fortunato's behalf by slamming the appropriate coins on the counter, and walking out with her chin at an angle that dared anyone in that store to say anything further. The problem arose when she told Lewis about it that evening, expecting agreement, and received instead a very long silence followed by a carefully worded concern about whether it was wise to make enemies of the town's supply merchant. She had looked at him for a long moment. "You knew about this practice," she said. "It was not a question." His jaw tightened. "I knew there were certain inequities in town, and you allowed Fortunato to continue being subjected to them." "Fortunato is a grown man who makes his own choices about what Fortunato works for you," she said. "You have influence with Gentry. You could have addressed this years ago and chose not to." The silence that followed was the kind that has edges. "I have a business to run," Lewis said finally, "and relationships with suppliers that keep this ranch functioning, and that is more important than what is right," she said. She was not shouting. She never actually shouted. She simply had a voice that carried, and right now it was carrying every bit of its natural power. She went upstairs without eating dinner, which she had never done before, and she sat on the edge of her bed with her hands in her lap and thought about what she had said, and whether she had been fair to him, and whether fairness was even the point when the underlying situation was so unjust. She had expected him to be defensive. She had expected him to maintain his position or to dismiss the conversation. What she had not expected was the knock on her door at 9 o'clock. "Come in," she said. He opened the door and stood in the frame without entering. He was holding his hat. He had lines around his eyes that she had not noticed before, or perhaps had not let herself notice. "I spoke with Fortunato tonight," he said. She waited. "I should have done it years ago," he said. "He told me he never mentioned it because he did not want to make trouble for himself or for the ranch. He has lived his whole life learning to calculate exactly how much injustice to tolerate in order to survive, and I allowed that calculation to continue because it was easier for me." He paused. "I am going into town tomorrow to speak with Gentry. If he is unwilling to be reasonable, I will find a different supplier in Wichita and I will take my account with me." Stella looked at him for a long moment. "That is a good decision," she said. "I am telling you because you were right," he said. "And because being wrong does not sit well with me, but being wrong and not acknowledging it would sit considerably worse." She stood up. "Have you had dinner?" "No." "Come downstairs," she said. "There is soup on the back of the stove." They went downstairs together, and she heated the soup, and they ate at the kitchen table in the lamplight, and the conversation that followed was quieter and more honest than any they had yet had, moving through territory that felt important without either of them naming it as such. They talked about fairness and about the particular way that unjust systems made themselves invisible to the people they benefited. They talked about what Lewis had seen in Texas and what Stella had seen in St. Louis, and how the machinery of inequality dressed itself differently in different places, but ran on the same fuel everywhere. Lewis went to town the next morning. Gentry was not reasonable. Lewis found a supplier in Wichita and sent word that same week, and when the first delivery arrived and Fortunato helped unload it at the correct price without any arithmetic required, the old man looked at Lewis with an expression that was not quite gratitude and not quite surprise, but was something that encompassed both and went deeper than either. He told Stella about it that evening. She was standing at the stove, and she turned and looked at him and felt the thing in her chest that she had been carefully not naming do something large and complicated. "You are a good man," she said, and went back to the stove. He stood there for a moment behind her and then sat down, and she could feel him watching her, and she kept her face toward the stove and her hands busy. July brought the worst heat, and also a cattle drive complication that required Lewis to ride out for 3 days to manage a dispute at the grazing boundary with a neighboring ranch. A man named Curtis Webb, who had been encroaching on Abbott land for 2 years in the particular slow and legal-looking way that land disputes in this era were often conducted, moving fences inches at a time and relying on the difficulty of surveying remote grassland to cover his tracks. Lewis left Silas in charge of the ranch and took Fortunato and Dale Holt with him, and Stella was left with Jimmy Pratt and Gus Holt and the property, and she discovered something she had not known about herself, which was that she was not good at waiting. She was good at working. She planted the rest of the garden's second succession, repaired 2 hinges on the smokehouse door, reorganized the root cellar with a thoroughness that would have made Marta Angel either very proud or extremely agitated, and baked enough bread to last the remaining hands through the week. She did all of this and was still awake at 11 the first night, staring at the ceiling, which was not a ceiling she was accustomed to staring at, worrying about anyone. Jimmy, who was perceptive in the specific way of 19-year-olds who pay attention, told her on the second morning that Mr. Abbott had ridden that same boundary 2 years prior and come back without a mark on him. "I am not worried," she said, turning bread dough with unnecessary force. "Yes, ma'am," Jimmy said, in the tone of someone who has decided not to argue with a woman who is handling dough as though it has offended her. Lewis came back on the 4th day, a day earlier than expected, riding in at mid-afternoon with the dust of 3 days' travel on him, and a resolution in his favor regarding the boundary, formalized by the county surveyor who had accompanied them on the 2nd day. He rode past the kitchen garden and stopped when he saw Stella in it, kneeling in the dirt pulling weeds with the specific focused aggression she brought to any task she did while thinking about something else. She looked up at the sound of hooves and shaded her eyes, and he swung down from the horse and stood there with the reins in his hand and trailed dust in his hair, and she stood up from the dirt. She looked at him for a moment to confirm all his parts were present and accounted for. Then she said, "The boundary dispute. Resolved," he said, "in our favor." "Good," she said. "You look terrible. Go wash up. I'll have dinner ready in an hour," he smiled. It was the full smile, the real one, and it did the thing to his face that she had been cataloging since May with great unwillingness to admit she was doing so. "It is good to be back," he said. "It's good to have fewer horses to worry about," she said, which was not what she meant at all, and he knew it, and she knew he knew it, and she went inside before the conversation could become something she was not yet ready for. The evening was warm enough to eat on the porch, and they did, sitting in 2 of the wooden chairs Lewis had built himself several years ago, the plates balanced on their knees, the prairie evening settling around them in gradations of orange and purple. The horses were quiet in the pasture. The cottonwood trees moved in the small wind that came up at sundown. "Webb won't stop," Lewis said. "He'll try something different next time. He wants this land." "What will you do?" "Keep being harder to move than he expects," he said. She understood what he meant. It was not bravado. It was the straightforward statement of someone who has decided what they are willing to defend and has accepted the ongoing cost of defending it. "This land is worth defending," she said. He looked at her sideways. "You said that like you have a stake in it." She looked at the horizon. The last light was going, leaving the sky the color of a bruised plum at the edge and deep blue directly overhead, and the first stars were appearing. "I feel like I do," she said, which surprised her. "I know it is not mine. I know I am here to cook and manage the house. But when I am in that garden, or when I see the storms come in from the southwest, or when Patience's foal runs in the east pasture and he is learning how his legs work," she stopped. "I feel like I belong to this land somewhat," she said, "even if it does not belong to me." The silence that followed was the gentlest kind. "Marta said the same thing," Lewis said quietly. "After her first year here, she said this land gets inside you like dust gets inside a watch. You stop being able to imagine working without it." He was quiet for a moment. "She also said this house needed someone who could fill it properly," he said. "Not in terms of space, in terms of—" He stopped. He set down his fork and looked at his hands. "She meant someone who was fully here, present, not just doing the tasks but actually inhabiting the place." Stella waited. "I think she would have liked you enormously," he said. She thought about the woman she had never met, the woman who had designed a kitchen and requested trees and chosen this particular piece of enormous sky. "I think I would have liked her too," she said. The conversation ended there, softly and without ceremony, and they sat in the dark for another half hour without talking, listening to the prairie night. and it was the most comfortable silence Stella had ever sat inside. August was when everything changed, though Stella would later say the change had been accumulating since May, and August was simply when it became undeniable. It began with the county fair in Caldwell, which occurred in the second week of the month, and which the entire surrounding community attended on the principle that in a place where entertainment was scarce, you attended everything available and made the most of it. Lewis had not gone in several years. It was Silas who proposed it to the crew as a collective outing, and it was Jimmy who suggested, with the elaborate casualness of a 19-year-old who was trying to seem like he wasn't trying, that Miss Sullivan might enjoy seeing the town in a festive context. Lewis knocked on her door that evening and asked if she would like to go. She said yes before she had finished deciding whether to say yes, which was itself informative. The fair was exactly what a Kansas county fair in 1878 should have been. There were cattle and horse competitions, a series of vendor stalls selling everything from ribbons to patent medicines that made extravagant promises, food that was simple and good, and enough of Caldwell's population gathered in one place to make the main street feel genuinely crowded for once. The sky was blue and enormous and kind, which was a mercy from August. Stella and Lewis walked through the fair together, not exactly as a couple, but in the proximity that had become natural between them, close enough that occasionally their arms brushed and neither of them moved away. Silas and the Holt brothers had disappeared into the crowd almost immediately, almost certainly toward the area where someone had set up card tables, and Jimmy had been absorbed by a cluster of young people his age with the speed of an iron filing meeting a magnet. So it was just the two of them, moving through the stalls, and Lewis bought her a paper cone of roasted peanuts, and she taught him a thing about judging cattle quality that he did not know, and they watched a horse race from the fence rail and argued companionably about which of the middle finishers had the better stride, and they ate meat pies from a vendor near the east tent, and she got sauce on her chin, and he told her with a completely straight face that she had something on her face. And she scrubbed at the wrong spot 3 times before he took out his handkerchief and reached across and wiped it himself, and then they both went very still. His hand was steady. His eyes were on her face, and they were very close together, and the noise of the fair seemed to come from a much greater distance than it actually did. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was completely level. She was proud of it. "Of course," he said, and stepped back, and they continued walking, but something had been shifted in the air between them that did not shift back. Later in the afternoon, there was a music performance near the central tent, a fiddle player and a woman who played the concertina, and the crowd had cleared a space for dancing. Several couples were dancing already, including Silas, who had apparently convinced the woman from the ribbon stall to dance with him through some alchemy of persistence and charm. Lewis and Stella were standing at the edge of the crowd, and she was watching the dancers with the expression of someone who wants something and has not yet decided whether to want it in public. "Do you dance?" he asked. "I do," she said. "I am very tall, so most men find it awkward." "I am almost 6 feet tall," he said. "Would it be awkward?" She looked at him. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I haven't tried with you." He held out his hand. She looked at it for a moment, then she took it. He was a good dancer, which surprised her, not because he was clumsy in other areas, but because dancing required a particular willingness to be in motion with another person that she had not associated with his general quality of self-containment. But he was good. He led clearly and with confidence, and he was tall enough that the height worked rather than fought, and she discovered that dancing with someone the right size felt entirely different from what she had previously known the experience to be. Also, his hand was warm at the small of her back, and she was going to have to stop thinking about that immediately. They danced twice. The second time was slower, the fiddle player taking a deliberate tempo, and they were close enough that she could feel the warmth from his arm, and his chin was near her temple, and the September heat was in everything. And when the song ended, he held her hand a beat longer than was technically necessary before releasing it. "You are not awkward," he said. "Neither are you," she said, and her voice had done something different in the lower register that she had not authorized. They drove home that evening in the wagon, the whole crew spread through the back, Jimmy asleep against Gus Holt's shoulder. Sila's telling a story about the card tables that required him to use both hands for illustration. Lewis drove. Stella sat beside him on the bench, not quite touching, the evening air cool at last, the stars coming up ahead of them over the eastern horizon. He said nothing particular. Neither did she. But his elbow rested against hers on the wagon bench, easy and warm, and neither of them moved away, and the prairie road rolled out ahead of them like a sentence that had not yet reached its period. And Stella Sullivan decided, driving home in the dark with the Kansas stars overhead and the dust of the fair still in her hair, that she had run out of reasons not to know what she already knew. She was in love with Lewis Abbott. She had been for some time. The specific date of origin was unclear and probably irrelevant. It was present and large, and it complicated every practical aspect of her situation in ways she needed to think about carefully. She thought about it for 3 days, which for Stella was the equivalent of several years of deliberation for most people. On the 4th morning, she went down to breakfast to find Lewis already at the kitchen table with his coffee, which was not unusual, and he looked up when she came in and said good morning with the same calm, direct manner he always used, and then he said, "I need to talk to you about something." And she said, "So do I." And they stopped and looked at each other across the kitchen. "You first," he said. "No," she said. "You first." She went to the stove and started the oatmeal because she needed something to do with her hands. He set his coffee cup down. She heard him do it. "I have been thinking about whether what I want to say is appropriate," he said, "given that you work in my house, given that what you do here is important, and I would not want to make it strange or to place you in a situation where you feel you have to respond in a particular way." She did not turn around. "You are trying to give me an exit before you have even said the thing," she said. "I am trying to be fair," he said. "Then be direct," she said. "Being direct is more fair than being careful." A pause. "I have developed feelings for you," he said, and his voice was steady with the effort of someone who has decided that steadiness is the only option available. "Significant feelings, the kind that change how I understand what this house is and what I want it to be. I have not felt this since Alina, and I did not expect to, and I want to be clear that I am not asking you to respond to this in any particular way or to change anything about our arrangement if you do not wish to." Stella stood at the stove for a moment. The oatmeal was stirring itself, practically. Her hands were doing something practical and she was doing something else. She turned around. "Lewis," she said. He was looking at her. His hat was on the table in front of him and his hands were wrapped around his coffee cup, and he looked exactly like what he was, which was a steady, honest, capable man who had been lonelier than he let on for 4 years, and who had said a true thing at considerable cost. "I went to bed 3 nights ago," she said, "and told myself I was going to stop feeling what I am feeling because it would complicate things. And I spent 3 days discovering that I cannot do that and that I was a fool to try." He was very still. "I am in love with you," she said. "I am going to say it plainly because I have found that is the only way I know how to say anything, and I think you have earned a plain statement." She crossed her arms. "I did not come to Kansas looking for this. I came to work, and I am still going to work very hard and run this house well because that is who I am regardless of anything else. But I love you, and I have for some time, and I think you should know it." He stood up from the table. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, which was possible because it was a large kitchen, but he had a long stride, and he stopped in front of her, and he was close, and she realized that standing this close to him, they were nearly the same height and she could see his eyes very clearly, and what was in them was something warm and absolutely certain. "Stella," he said. "Lewis," she said. He raised his hand and tucked a strand of escaped red hair behind her ear with a care that was almost reverent, and then he kissed her, and it was quiet and serious and entirely without performance, which was exactly what she would have wanted if she had ever let herself want it specifically. The oatmeal boiled over. She pulled back, turned to the stove, moved the pot, and then started laughing, and he started laughing too, and they stood in the kitchen with the smell of slightly scorched oatmeal and morning coffee around them and laughed until it settled into something warm and permanent. "The oatmeal," he said. "Is fine," she said. "Mostly." He was smiling at her with the full smile, the one that took his face apart and reassembled it younger. And she thought, very clearly, that this was the place she had been looking for all her life without knowing she was looking. What followed was a courtship of the most practical and genuine kind, because Lewis Abbott and Stella Sullivan were not people who expressed love through grand gestures and decorative language. They expressed it through the daily fabric of their life on the ranch, through Lewis appearing at the garden fence with extra water when she was planting in the July heat, and through Stella having his coffee ready the moment his boots hit the kitchen floor each morning, and through long evening conversations on the porch that ranged from cattle prices to what they each believed happened after death, to whether Gerald the pig had been correctly named, and why pig naming generally was an undervalued art. He asked her to ride with him in late August to see the eastern boundary of the property, where the land rolled into a creek bottom that was thick with cottonwoods and filled in the afternoon light with a particular gold that no other hour produced. She was not a skilled rider. She told him this directly. He spent 2 weeks teaching her on his gentlest horse, a bay mare named Theodora, who seemed to find the whole enterprise charming and behaved herself perfectly. She became a competent rider. She did not become graceful, and she did not care. He brought her to the creek bottom on a Tuesday when the light was exactly right, and she stood at the edge of the water in the cottonwood gold with her hand shading her eyes, and she felt the land go inside her the way Marta had described, through the eyes and the lungs and the skin, until it was simply part of her circuitry. "This is mine," she said, and then caught herself. "Not in the legal sense. I know what you mean," he said. He was watching her with an expression that she now knew well enough to read, and what it said was that he was very certain about something and working up to saying it in the precise way he always worked up to saying important things. "Stella," he said. "I know what you are about to say," she said. "Do you?" "You are about to say something about the legal sense," she said, "about making it mine in the legal sense." He was quiet for a moment. "I was going to say it differently. I know. But I want to say something first." She turned from the water. "I know this is fast. I know it has been only a few months. I know you had a life here before me and a marriage here before me, and I am not asking you to forget any of that or to replace any of it. Aliner built this place with you, and this ranch has her in it as much as it has you, and I think that is something to honor, not something to clear away." She paused. "I want to be part of this. I want to build something here alongside what is already here, not instead of it." He looked at her for a very long time. His expression had moved past the careful measuring quality into something more open and more unguarded than she had ever seen it, and it made him look very much like the man he must have been before grief had taught him to be careful. "Marry me," he said. "I had planned to say more around it, but you have made me want to simply say it." "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He reached out and took her hand at the edge of the creek, in the cottonwood light, and she held his hand back, and the Kansas afternoon stood around them in its enormous, honest way, and said nothing at all, because nothing needed saying. They were married in October, when the prairie had gone gold and the air had the particular clean, cold edge that meant the first frost was coming. The ceremony was small by necessity and preference. The county judge came out from Caldwell, and the witnesses were Silas Crane and Fortunato Reyes, and the entire ranch crew was present with their Sunday clothes mostly clean, and Jimmy Pratt cried with a complete lack of self-consciousness that everyone pretended not to notice. Stella wore her best dress, which was a deep green that did things for her complexion and was long enough for her height, which she had never previously achieved. And she did not carry flowers because she found them more inconvenient than meaningful, but she had pinned a single dried wildflower from the creek bottom into her braided hair. Lewis wore his good coat, and had apparently done something to his hair that Silas later said took 20 minutes and 2 separate opinions to accomplish. The judge read the words. They both said yes. Lewis put a plain gold ring on her finger that had belonged to his mother, which he had asked Stella about beforehand, explaining its history and asking whether she minded it being his mother's rather than new, and she had told him that she would be honored. Then they were married, and the crew made sounds of appreciation, and Silas was so moved by his own words of congratulation that he had to stop and start over twice, and Fortunato pressed both of Stella's hands between his and said something in Spanish that she did not fully understand but felt in every part of her bones. They had dinner that evening in the large kitchen, all of them together, the crew and the house together for once, and Stella cooked an enormous meal, roasted beef and potatoes and 3 different vegetables and 2 kinds of bread, and a dried apple cake that she had stayed up until midnight the night before preparing. The kitchen was full of people and lamplight and voices, and the specific joy that happens when a group of people who work hard together are given a legitimate reason to stop working and simply be glad. Lewis sat at the head of the table and watched it all with an expression that she would carry with her for the rest of her life, the expression of a man who had believed for 4 years that gladness in this house was something that belonged to the past, and who was discovering it in the present, and who did not entirely know what to do with the discovery except to hold it very carefully. She sat next to him. She put her hand on the table. He put his hand over hers. They did not make a show of it. It was simply there. In the winter that first year of their marriage, Caldwell went through a difficult season in multiple respects. A hard cold snap came in December that was worse than anyone had expected, and Lewis spent 3 days riding out with the crew breaking ice on the water troughs and moving cattle to sheltered ground, and Stella kept the fires burning and the food ready and the house functional with the particular quiet competence that was her most fundamental quality. There was also trouble of a different kind. Curtis Webb, the neighboring rancher who had been encroaching on Abbott land through the summer, apparently decided that winter was an appropriate time for a different approach. He sent a man to town to spread the kind of stories about Lewis that are difficult to disprove because they are vague, suggesting unreliable character and shaky business dealings to anyone who would listen. In a small town in 1878, stories like this had weight. Stella heard it from the dry goods merchant's wife on a Wednesday in December when she went into town for supplies, told in the roundabout way that meant it was intended to be taken seriously. She drove home and told Lewis that evening calmly and without embellishment, laying out exactly what she had heard and where she had heard it. He was quiet for a long time. "This is Webb," he said. "Without question," she said. "I can go to town and address it directly, but direct denial of vague accusations always looks defensive." "No," she said. "You do not go to town. I do. I have been buying supplies in Caldwell every week for 7 months. I know every merchant in half the households. I have standing there that you do not because I am newer and they have not yet formed strong opinions." He looked at her. "Stella, I am not asking for permission," she said pleasantly. "I'm explaining my plan." The corner of his mouth moved. "I know. She went to town on Thursday. She was there for most of the day. She spoke to the dry goods merchant and the livery owner and the woman who ran the Caldwell boarding house and 3 other significant points of community information flow, not in the way of someone defending her husband against rumors, but in the natural way of a woman who knows the people she is talking to and speaks plainly about the people she loves. She talked about the boundary survey and its result, verified and county documented. She talked about Lewis's account with the Wichita supplier and why he had moved it. She talked about the fence repairs and the water rights and the straightforward, unglamorous work of running an honest ranch. She did not talk about Webb by name. She did not need to. By Friday, the stories had stopped circulating. By the following week, 2 other ranching families in the area who had their own concerns about Webb's expansionary habits had come quietly to Lewis with conversations about common interests and mutual monitoring of the situation. Webb did not make another significant move that winter. Lewis came into the kitchen on the Friday evening and stood behind her while she was finishing up the dishes, and put both arms around her from behind, and rested his chin on the top of her head, which was possible because of their particular configuration of heights, and said nothing for a long moment. "Thank you," he said finally. "The soup is on the stove," she said. "Do not let it burn." He laughed into her hair and let her go, and she handed him the ladle. By the spring of their first full year together, the ranch was doing well in all the practical measurements available. The cattle count was up, the garden was producing reliably, the crew was stable and functioning well, and Webb had apparently decided that direct and indirect approaches to acquiring Abbott land were both more trouble than they were worth, and had turned his expansionary attention southward. And Stella told Lewis in April that she was expecting a child. She told him at the kitchen table over breakfast, matter-of-factly, in the middle of a sentence about the garden planting schedule, as if it were another piece of information to organize around. Lewis put down his coffee. He looked at her for a moment in which several different things moved through his expression in rapid succession, none of them small. "Are you certain?" he said. "I am a practical woman," she said. "I am certain." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His hand was warm and large and had calluses from decades of ranch work, and it held hers with a steadiness that was one of the things she loved most about him. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you feeling?" "I am well," she said. "I am very well. I have more opinions than ever about the garden, and I cannot smell coffee in the morning without some difficulty, but I am well." She looked at him directly. "Are you?" He was quiet for a moment, and in that moment she could see everything moving in him, the joy and the grief and the memory of Alina and the love for her and the hope that was arriving now through the door left open by all of it. "Yes," he said. "I am." He pressed her hand. "Very." She squeezed back and reached for her oatmeal. The pregnancy was uncomplicated, which Stella managed by treating it as a practical condition rather than a dramatic event, though she did accept a slightly reduced riding schedule from July onward with only mild argument. Lewis was attentive in the specific way that suited them both, which was to say he did not fuss or hover, but he was always present, always ready, always paying the particular quality of attention that she had learned in the first weeks on the ranch was his truest mode of love. Fortunato's wife, a calm and capable woman named Concepcion who lived in town and visited the ranch with some regularity, became Stella's closest friend during this period. She was a woman of 40 who had raised 6 children and who had an enormous fund of practical wisdom delivered in a mixture of Spanish and English with no apology for either language, and she and Stella got on immediately and well, understanding each other through the directness that both of them defaulted to. "You are going to have a loud child," Concepcion told her in August, quite seriously. "I know," Stella said, equally serious. "I am preparing the house." The baby arrived on a November night, delivered by Concepcion and a doctor from Caldwell who had ridden out at Lewis's request. And it was a boy, large and opinionated from his first breath, with dark hair and green eyes that would settle eventually into a brown that was his father's color, but had for now the shifting uncertainty of the newly arrived. Lewis held his son for the first time in the kitchen, because that was where the warmth was and where the lamplight was good, sitting in the chair he always sat in, and the expression on his face was beyond Stella's capacity to describe, and she did not try. She simply watched from the bed they had moved to the downstairs room for this purpose, exhausted and extraordinarily awake, and she let herself feel everything without managing it for once. "What shall we call him?" Lewis said, very quietly, as if a loud question might disturb the gravity of the moment. "James," she said, "for my father." He looked up at her. He nodded. "James Abbott," he said, testing it. He looked back at the baby. "Hello, James." James responded by making a sound that expressed strong opinions without specifying their content. "He sounds like his mother," Lewis said. "Good," Stella said and closed her eyes. James turned out to be a child who required a great deal of space, energetically speaking. He walked at 10 months, talked at 12, and by the time he was 2 had formed clear and non-negotiable views on the subject of which livestock were interesting and which were not, cattle ranking high and chickens ranking so low as to be beneath active contempt. He followed Fortunato around the barn with the focused attention of an apprentice, and Fortunato received this with the same grave dignity he brought to everything, and taught the boy the names of things in 2 languages, which James assembled into a working vocabulary that delighted his parents and occasionally confused strangers. The years moved in the way that years on good land move when the people working it are doing so with purpose and love, with seasons and changes and small dramas and large joys, and the accumulation of memory that makes a place into a home that is no longer separable from the people who made it. In the spring when James was 3, Stella found that they were expecting again. She told Lewis this time over dinner, also matter-of-factly, and he said again, with the expression of a man who is delighted and attempting to be measured about the delight, and she said, yes, again, and served him more potatoes. This time the baby arrived in autumn and was a girl. They named her Clara, for Lewis's mother, whose gold ring was still on Stella's hand, and whose name deserved to be spoken in this house again. Clara was different from James in every measurable way. Where he was loud, she was watchful. Where he charged forward, she considered. Where he was interested in cattle and horses and anything that moved in a loud and dramatic way, she was interested in the garden and the kitchen, and in the particular quality of light at different hours, which she had inherited from a grandmother she had never met. She followed Stella everywhere from the time she could walk, sitting on the kitchen floor with a wooden spoon and a bowl while her mother baked, watching with her father's steady, measuring eyes. James, for his part, was a devoted if sometimes overwhelming older brother. He showed Clara how to pet Theodora the bay mare without startling her, a piece of knowledge he imparted with the serious authority of someone very much older than 5, and he appointed himself her protector during thunderstorms with a solemnity that made both Stella and Lewis hide their smiles behind their hands. The ranch grew. Lewis took on 2 additional hands in the 2nd year and expanded the cattle count by another 100 head, and the new grazing arrangement with the northern pasture that Stella had suggested during one of their evening conversations proved so effective that Lewis mentioned it to 2 neighboring ranchers, both of whom adopted a version of it and one of whom, a widow named Frances Darby, became a steady presence in their social circle and a source of considerable information about the larger movements of land and commerce in the county. Frances was the one who told them, on a spring evening in 1882, that Curtis Webb had finally overextended himself. He had borrowed heavily against his land, attempted to expand into a territory dispute that involved 3 other ranching families and the county surveyor, and when the legal resolution came, it came in the form of a substantial judgment against him that required the sale of a significant portion of his range. Lewis heard this news and said nothing for a moment. Stella watched him from across the dinner table. "I do not feel satisfaction about his misfortune," Lewis said carefully. "He is a man who made choices and has faced their consequences." "You feel some satisfaction," she said. He looked at her. "Small," he said, "appropriately small." "Good," she said. "He tried to take your land, spread lies about your character, and treated the boundary survey as a personal inconvenience rather than a legal outcome. Small satisfaction is proportionate." Lewis held her gaze and then smiled slowly, the full smile. "I love you enormously," he said. "I know," she said. "Pass the bread." Fortunato retired from full-time ranch work in the spring of 1883. At an age he approximated as somewhere past 70, since the records of his birth were approximate themselves, and in a country that had not always been concerned with keeping records of him. Lewis made him a settlement that was fair and considerable, and Fortunato and Concepcion moved into a small house in Caldwell that their eldest son had built for them. And Sunday dinners at the Abbott Ranch continued to include them with no change in their welcome. Jimmy Pratt, who was no longer 19 and was by now 24, became the senior hand after Fortunato's retirement, having learned enough in 5 years from the old man to fill a reasonable portion of the gap. He was still enthusiastic to a degree that occasionally alarmed the cattle, but he had developed a competence that matched the enthusiasm, and he managed the new hands well because he remembered being 19 and tried to treat it with appropriate sympathy. Sila's remained. Sila's would apparently remain until the land itself ran out. Stella planted a new section of garden in the spring of 1883, expanding it to include fruit trees, an ambition she had held since the first year, but that had required the establishment of the water line Lewis had dug the previous fall to make practical. She planted 2 apple trees, a pear tree, and a plum tree, and she told Lewis on the morning she planted them that they would not bear fruit for several years. "I know," he said. He was leaning on the garden fence watching her work. "So I am planting them for James and Clara more than for us," she said, "or possibly for whoever James and Clara plant alongside their own lives." He was quiet for a moment. "You think about the long horizon," he said. "This land thinks in centuries," she said, pressing soil around the base of the apple tree. "It seems right to think in decades at minimum." She heard him move, and then he was beside her, kneeling in the dirt, helping her tamp the soil around the roots of the second tree. They worked in the garden together until mid-morning, moving from tree to tree, working without speaking very much because they did not need to, because they were people who had learned over the years to share space without filling it, to be present without performing the presence. The Kansas spring was around them, that particular light that came before the heat, when everything was still possible. James appeared at the garden fence at some point, trailing Clara by the hand with the authority of an older sibling who had decided the younger one was coming whether she liked it or not. Clara did not appear to object. She was 4 years old and had her father's eyes and her mother's chin and her own particular quality of attention that was already clearly her most powerful feature. "Can we help?" James asked. Lewis looked at Stella. Stella looked at James with the assessing expression she brought to all practical proposals. "Get a small shovel from the barn," she said, "the one hanging on the south wall, and bring the watering can." James was gone at a run before she finished the sentence. Clara walked to the garden gate with great dignity and stood waiting for someone to open it, which Lewis did, sweeping it open with unnecessary ceremony that made her smile in the particular way she had where only one corner of her mouth moved. "Just like her mother," Lewis murmured, coming back to kneel beside Stella. "She gets the stoic expressions from you," Stella said. "I am not stoic," he said. "Lewis," she said. "I express things," he said, "internally." She laughed, and he laughed, and Clara stood in the garden watching her parents laugh together with the serious expression of someone cataloging an important fact about the world. And James came back from the barn at a speed that suggested he had not walked any part of the return journey. They planted the rest of the garden that morning, all 4 of them, in the particular warmth of a family that has learned to work alongside each other and finds it more satisfying than any individual effort. That summer Stella turned 35. Lewis had known about birthdays that she could not celebrate in the way most people meant the word, since the farm income was reliable but not lavish, and so he had long since adopted the practice of marking her birthday in ways that were more meaningful than expensive. The year she turned 35, he took her back to the creek bottom where he had proposed, just the 2 of them, on the Tuesday when the light was right, the cottonwood gold and the water running clear and cold below them, and they sat in the grass at the edge of the water for 2 hours doing nothing in particular. And she thought that it was the most extravagant thing anyone had ever given her, and that she would not trade it for anything that cost money. She told him that she loved him in a dozen different ways over the course of those 2 hours, only once with words, and all the other ways with the quality of her attention and the way she leaned against his shoulder in the afternoon sun, and the way she laughed at something he said without softening it or making it polite, the full laugh, the one that rang off things. "You are still the loudest person I have ever encountered," he said, at some point in the afternoon. "Is that a complaint?" she said. "Not remotely," he said, and kissed her hair. "This land needs it." She had been thinking for years about what he had meant when he said that, and she thought she understood it now. The prairie was enormous and indifferent in the specific way of things that are ancient and permanent, and it did not soften itself for you or arrange itself around your preferences. You either came to it with your whole self, every quality you possessed, the size of your voice and the stubbornness of your purpose and the full height of your presence, or you did not last in it. The land did not want something small and careful. It wanted everything you had. She had arrived here with everything she had, and she had not diminished any of it, and the land had given her everything back in the form of this ranch, these trees, these children, this man beside her in the cottonwood light. "I am glad I came to Kansas," she said. "So am I," he said, with a conviction that contained years. In the fall of 1884, James started attending the school in Caldwell, which required a 4-mile ride on Theodora's successor, a steady pony named Aristotle who had been purchased specifically for this purpose, and who had the appropriate temperament for a child still learning the negotiation between his intentions and the horses. James took to school with the same focused energy he brought to everything, and came home each evening full of information that he delivered to the family at dinner, as though they were daily reports that required immediate filing. Clara was by this time 5, and she was already reading, a fact discovered when Stella found her one morning sitting at the kitchen table with Lewis's almanac, working through it with her finger under the words. Lewis taught her in the evenings, sitting with her at the kitchen table with a lamp between them, and Stella watched from across the kitchen and felt the full force of a love that had none of the doubt or qualification that love was so often required to contain. In the winter of 1884, Stella told Lewis that she was expecting again. She was 36, he was 40. "Are you well?" he asked, the same first question he had always asked. "I am well," she said. "And I am going to tell Concepcion immediately, because she will be insufferable if she hears it from anyone else." He laughed and pressed his hand against her cheek, and looked at her with the full weight of everything they had built together, and she pressed her hand over his and let him. The third child was born in the summer of 1885, on a warm July morning when the windows were open, and the cottonwoods were in full leaf, and the sound of the ranch going about its business came through the air like a quiet affirmation that everything was continuing as it should. It was a boy. They named him Thomas, which was not anyone's name but was a name that had simply suited him from the first moment, solid and clear, which he was. A quiet baby, a content baby, the easiest of the three in every practical regard, as if he had taken stock of the situation, and decided that the household was already adequately loud without his contribution. James, at 7, received his new brother with the kind of solemn investment that suggested he had already begun composing the stories he was going to tell him about the ranch. Clara, at 6, sat beside her mother's bed and stroked Thomas's very small hand with one finger, and looked at Stella with an expression of complete gravity. "He is very small," Clara said. "You are also very small," Stella said. "I am not small now," Clara said, with the satisfaction of someone making an important factual clarification. "No," Stella agreed. "You are not." Silas Crane cried again. He cried at every significant event connected to the Abbott family, and had entirely stopped being embarrassed about it. And when Jimmy Pratt pointed this out, Silas explained that a man who did not feel things deeply was simply a man who was not paying attention, and Jimmy had no ready response to that. Thomas grew. James grew. Clara grew. The apple trees in the garden grew, and by the time Thomas was 3 years old, the first blossoms were appearing on the early maturing apple, and Stella stood in the garden on the spring morning they opened and felt the particular satisfaction of a person who plants something knowing they will not see its fullness immediately, who trusts the long horizon enough to commit to it. Lewis came to stand beside her. "The apples," she said. "I see them," he said. They stood there together in the garden in the April morning, not speaking, watching the blossoms in the early Kansas sun, and around them the ranch was beginning its day. The sounds of the barn and the horses and Jimmy's voice carrying across the pasture, directing the morning work, and the smell of the bread Stella had left in the oven and would need to go back to in 15 minutes, and somewhere in the house Clara's voice talking to Thomas with the patient authority of someone who has taken it upon herself to teach him the names of things, starting with the important ones. Lewis put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they were exactly the right height for it, which she had thought since the first time and had never stopped finding satisfying. "This is what I wanted," he said. "When I came here in 1870, I did not know what I wanted precisely, but this was it." "You could not have known," she said. "You had not met me yet." He looked down at her. "True," he said. "Incomplete planning on my part." She smiled up at him. "Fortunate correction," she said. He kissed her forehead. She turned back to the apple blossoms. The years continued, as years do on good land worked by good people, without pause or apology, bringing with them the full and varied catalog of a life lived with purpose. Difficult winters and abundant summers, cattle prices that rose and fell and rose again, the children growing into themselves in ways that were constantly surprising and somehow never shocking because they were so clearly becoming who they had always been. James at 12 was already riding full days with the crew, learning the land from the ground up with the determination of someone who intended to know every inch of it. Clara at 11 was halfway through every book in the house and had begun requesting specific volumes from Caldwell, with the uncompromising precision of a scholar who knew what she was looking for. Thomas at 5 had decided that his particular interest was in the horses, and spent more time in the barn than anywhere else, communicating with the animals in a low, patient voice that Fortunato, when he visited, said was exactly the right way to talk to something that did not have language but understood tone perfectly. Silas finally retired in 1889, at an age that he refused to specify, to a small claim of his own a few miles north that he had been quietly accumulating for years. He came back to the ranch every week for dinner and for the pleasure of the company, and for the gap-toothed laugh that the Abbott family reliably produced in him, and he told Lewis on a Sunday evening in autumn that if he had known what kind of man Lewis would turn out to be, he would have followed him from Texas rather than waiting to be hired. "You were not available in Texas," Lewis pointed out. "Details," Silas said, and ate more of Stella's pie. The Abbott Ranch in the early 1890s was a functioning, producing, community-respected piece of Kansas land that had expanded from the original claim in 3 deliberate additions negotiated over 12 years, always for land that Lewis had assessed and Stella had assessed separately, and then compared assessments, a process they found more reliable than either of them alone. The fruit trees Stella had planted in 1883 produced apples, pears, and plums in abundance every fall, and she had taught herself to preserve them in ways that filled the cellar through winter, and that Concepcion described as close to miraculous, which Stella denied while accepting the description as accurate. Clara, at 16, had by this time exhausted the educational resources of Caldwell School and was studying by correspondence, and from materials Lewis brought from Wichita on his twice-yearly supply trips. She intended to become a teacher. She had intended this for years and had never wavered, and Stella and Lewis had never once suggested that this was not a practical or appropriate plan, because they were people who had built their lives on practical plans that other people had found improbable. James, at 18, was a full working member of the ranch, riding with the confidence of someone who has spent his entire life on this land and knows its every variation. He had Lewis's steady quality and Stella's directness, which together produced a young man who was very quiet until he had something worth saying, and then said it with an accuracy that was sometimes startling. Thomas, at 13, had a way with horses that was already remarkable enough that neighboring ranchers had begun asking whether he was available for consultation, which he received with a modesty that his mother attributed to his father's influence, and his father attributed to a fundamental difference in Thomas's character from the other two, which was that he was genuinely not interested in being perceived as remarkable, only in doing the thing well. On an October evening in 1892, which was their 13th anniversary, Lewis and Stella sat on the porch as they had sat on the porch in every season for 13 years, with the prairie evening settling around them in the way it did when the day had been long and good. The cottonwood trees were enormous now, having had 13 extra years to grow, and they moved in the night wind with the sound that Stella had decided, over years of listening to it, was the most specific sound she knew. The lights were on in the house behind them, and they could hear Clara inside talking to James about something, and Thomas's voice occasionally punctuating the conversation with a single definitive word, the way he did. 13 years, Lewis said. 13 years, she said. You are still the loudest person I have ever met, he said. You still need 3 steps to cross the kitchen, she said. He laughed. She leaned her head against his shoulder. The prairie was dark and enormous around the lit house, rolling out in every direction to the dark horizon where the stars began, and the Abbott ranch sat in the middle of it like a lamp left on for someone coming home, warm and certain and completely itself. I want to tell you something, Lewis said, in the particular quiet voice he used when he meant to say something that he had been carrying for a while. Tell me, she said. When I wrote to your cousin looking for a housekeeper, he said, I was not looking for this. I was looking for someone who could manage the practical things because I was not managing them well on my own, and I thought that was all I was capable of looking for. I thought the part of me that could want more than that had gone. She waited. You came off that stagecoach, he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice, and knocked a man's hat off his head and did not apologize, and I did not think anything specific, but I felt something shift. He shook his head. I could not have told you what it was at the time. You looked at me like you were measuring something, she said. I noticed. I was, he said. I was measuring whether you were real. Whether someone like you was actually in front of me. She was quiet for a moment. I was real, she said. You were, he said. You are the most real thing I have ever known. He pressed his hand over hers on the arm of the chair. I want you to know that. Whatever happens in whatever comes after this, I want you to know that being loved by you has been the fullest thing in my life. She sat with that for a long moment, feeling it settle into the accumulated weight of all the other true things that had been said in this place over 13 years. Lewis, she said. You are going to make me cry in front of the prairie, she said, and I would prefer not to because it is a large audience. He laughed again, deep and warm and completely at home, and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they sat in the October dark with the stars overhead and the cottonwood trees breathing and the sound of their children inside the lit house, and the ranch all around them in the enormous Kansas night. She was too tall, they had said in Caldwell the first time she walked its main street. Too loud, too stubborn. Too much of everything a woman in 1878 was supposed to be the measured, careful version of. They had looked at her and calculated deficiency and found excess, and they had been wrong in every direction because they had been looking at it wrong. She was tall enough to see the distance. She was loud enough to be heard in a wind. She was stubborn enough to plant apple trees in 1883 and wait 9 years to taste their fruit without once losing faith that they would produce it. And Lewis Abbott had looked at her standing in the stage-lined dust of Caldwell, Kansas, and had taken her end of the trunk without ceremony, and had known in the slow, certain way he knew most things that whatever this land needed, she had it. He had been right. He usually was, about the things that mattered. The fire in the sitting room was still warm when they finally went in from the porch, later than they had intended, as it always was when they sat together in the evening. The children had gone to bed, or at least to their rooms, which was close enough. The house was quiet, with the full and inhabited quiet that is different in every particular from empty silence. Lewis banked the fire. Stella checked the locks on the doors, the windows, the familiar circuit she had been making for 13 years. They went upstairs together. From the east-facing window of the room that had once been given to her as the housekeeper's room and was now theirs, the prairie was dark and limitless and full of stars, and the cottonwood trees stood in the dark below, enormous with the years put into them, moving in the wind. This was the land. This was the house. These were the people who had made them both. All the debts were paid. All the disputes were settled. All the trees had come into their fruit. All the love that had begun in a kitchen over scorched oatmeal had grown through the years into something that had the weight and permanence of the land itself, something that would still be here long after any specific day or season, woven into the place the way the roots of old trees are woven into the ground, invisible and absolutely essential. Stella Sullivan Abbott stood at her east-facing window for a moment before the day was fully done, looking at the prairie dark, and felt every year of the life she had built here sit in her with a completeness that left no room for anything to be missing. Then she went to bed. The ranch was quiet. The stars were thick. The cottonwood trees moved in the night wind with the sound that was very close to breathing, or perhaps was breathing, belonging as they did to the same living system that produced the grass and the creek and the fruit on the apple trees, and the children asleep in their rooms, and the two people who had come together by letter and by chance, and by the particular honesty with which they had both chosen to meet the world. Outside, the prairie lay enormous and permanent in the October dark, going on past the edge of sight in every direction, indifferent and magnificent, and absolutely unchanged by the love that had happened on its surface. Inside, the lamp on the nightstand burned down to its last and went out, and the house on the Kansas plain was given over to the dark and the wind and the long, settled silence of a life that had found what it was looking for and stopped searching. There was nothing left open, nothing unresolved, nothing waiting at the edge of the story for a different ending. This was the ending, and it was good.